Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast.
Dracula. The name itself brings imagery of blood, vampires, and tyrants. Most of us know of Dracula, the vampire from the 1897 novel by Bram Stoker. Suave and sinister, Count Dracula is still one of the most popular vampire characters in literary history. Most of us also know that this fictional vampire was named after a real person, Vlad Dracula. Vlad Dracula was also known as Vlad the Impaler, a nickname he earned through bloodshed and brutality during his rule. I already discussed Vlad the Impaler in part 1 of this series on Patreon. In this episode, we're going to explore Bram Stoker's Dracula and how he changed vampire lore forever. We shall start from the beginning. Abraham Stoker, whose pen name is Bram Stoker, was an Irish novelist. His writing career started as a theatre critic for the Dublin Evening Mail, a newspaper which was co-owned by Sheridan Le Fanu, another Gothic writer famous for his vampire novel Carmilla. After giving a favorable review of famous actor Henry Irving's performance in Hamlet, Stoker became Irving's personal assistant and later the business manager for his theatre in London's West End. Through this connection to high society, Stoker met many famous writers, including Oscar Wilde and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. When not busy managing the theatre, Stoker traveled and wrote short stories and books. He visited the English coastal town of Whitby in 1890, and it's said that during this visit was when he started writing Dracula. According to Dr. Elizabeth Miller, Stoker spent several years researching Central and Eastern European folklore and myths surrounding vampires before writing the book. While some historians suggest he specifically researched Vlad the Impaler, there are no references to him in Stoker's notes. It's more likely Stoker only briefly came across the name Dracula while glancing through Romanian history, or perhaps through conversations with historians. Dracula is a work of fiction, but is presented as a collection of letters, diary entries, and newspaper articles. There is no single main character, but the book opens with diary entries from a solicitor named Jonathan Harker, who is visiting Transylvanian nobleman Count Dracula to assist him in purchasing property in England and arranging his move there. After several unsettling experiences, Harker flees the castle after learning Dracula is a vampire. Dracula still makes his way to England, settling in the town of Whitby. There, he plagues several young women, which results in a group of men hunting for him, led by vampire hunter Abraham Van Helsing. As the book was published in 1897, I don't think I'm spoiling anything by revealing that they eventually find and kill him. The character of Dracula and his vampiric powers are the focus of this episode. Like everything in the world, folklore changes over time, and the popularity of Dracula caused much of the old lore to fade into the background in favor of this new version of the vampire. In several previous episodes of the MCP, such as Vampire Burials and Bitten, we've discussed vampires and the original lore from Central and Eastern Europe. So after listening to this episode, if you want more vampire lore, you can check out those 2 episodes. Vampires, or vampire-like creatures, have origins as far back as ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome. Belief in an undead creature that sustains itself by drinking the blood of the living is a worldwide phenomenon with many specific versions that reflect the local cultures that perpetuate the myth. The version most of us think of today is the one that was inspired by Stoker's Dracula, a gaunt, pale humanoid creature with sharp, fang-like teeth that drinks blood from the neck of its victims. The traditional Slavic or Eastern European vampire wasn't pale or gaunt. It had a ruddy or red complexion and was bloated and swollen with the blood of its victims. It also wore a death shroud, but the fabric was chewed away from around the creature's mouth. The creature had once been human, but died of a fast-progressing disease. They were then possessed by an evil or unclean spirit, rose from the dead either at night or during the day, and fed on the living, causing the same symptoms that they themselves had suffered before death. The unclean or evil spirits came from those who had died before their time. All spirits were thought to linger for 40 days after death. Most were harmless, but the spirits of people who had been marginalized in life, such as criminals, differently abled people, murder victims, and those who took their own lives, were believed to cause harm to living humans, animals, and crops. There were several ways to prevent someone becoming a vampire after death. These included putting anti-vampire items called apotropaics in their graves. This was done during the initial burial or added to the grave up to 40 days after the burial, because this was when the soul might still return to the body and be cleansed. After 40 days, however, the vampire was seen as indestructible, and therefore the corpse had to be prevented from leaving the grave at all costs. This included turning the body face down so they could only dig deeper into the earth, leaving a sharpened sickle around their neck so that if they sat up they would be decapitated, or staking them directly into their coffins. The process of disease spread and contagion was not well known at the time, and the concept of the vampire seemed to account for what we now know are epidemics of disease. The bloated appearance and chewed death shroud are likely references to the bloat stage of human decomposition after death. As the suspected vampire was often exhumed in order to stop it from feeding, the bloated state of the body seemed to be evidence for the creature feeding on others. The chewed shroud had also been subject to taphonomic processes, with insect and bacterial breakdown of the body and its coverings starting where body fluids collect, such as the mouth. Before the conversion to Catholicism in the 7th to 9th century, Slavic pagans cremated their dead in order to release their souls. When they were converted, they had to switch to burial, which must have horrified the pagans, or at least made them fear for the souls of their deceased loved ones. They especially worried for the souls of the marginalized, who could become bitter and angry and return to their corpses to seek revenge. It was beneficial for the Catholic Church as an institution to support the idea of vampires, as the myth could be used as a method to maintain social and religious order. Basically, it was incorporated into the punishments one might receive for sinning. The list of unclean spirits that were at risk of becoming vampires grew to include the unbaptized, those conceived during holy times, sinners, and the excommunicated. This version of the bloated, shrouded vampire seems to originate in the 11th century CE. The characteristics changed slightly based on location. Many areas had their own local additions to the lore. We know a lot about vampire lore thanks to ethnographies written in the late 1800s to mid-1900s. These ethnographies recorded many aspects of daily village life, and demonology and vampires were quite prominent. Just remember that ethnographies were written by people from outside the local culture, and therefore included the cultural bias of the writers. So while we can see that demons and vampires were prevalent, the writer's interpretation of these might have skewed the original meaning. In summary, traditional vampires were bloated, ruddy-skinned, undead creatures who fed on the blood of the living, often killing them and turning them into vampires as well. They could be prevented, but after 40 days, there was no killing them, so they had to be sealed in their coffins. They were born of unclean spirits who took control of human corpses, causing disease and famine. While Bram Stoker included some of the traditional lore in his book, he added a great deal more. Dracula has other powers, many of which I'll go over in a moment. It's likely that Stoker was inspired to make these changes by Le Fanu's vampire novel Carmilla, which was published 25 years before, and the 1819 novel The Vampire by John Polidori. These novels, as well as several other vampire novels published around the same time as Dracula, included more personal and seductive elements that were not present in the previous lore. The vampire was no longer gruesome. They were alluring, yet terrifying. I'm going to discuss Dracula's powers and characteristics, but first an ad must play. If you find these ads annoying, you can access ad-free episodes by becoming a patron on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. At higher tiers, you also get access to outtakes, quizzes, peeks behind the scenes, and early looks at our YouTube videos. This podcast is based on academic research, and no AI is used in the process of researching, writing, or recording these episodes. It takes a lot of work, and every little bit of support helps immensely, even if it's just $2 a month. So please consider becoming a patron. Go to bit.ly/morbidpatron, that's bit.ly/morbidpatron, to read about the benefits and sign up. You'll have my eternal gratitude. As I mentioned, Stoker's charismatic, aristocratic vampire drew on several previous works of vampire fiction. The bloated, corpse-like vampire was first replaced by a charismatic and sophisticated vampire in John Polidori's 1819 serialized short story, The Vampire. This story was actually told by Lord Byron to Polidori during the same horror story contest that resulted in Mary Shelley's work, Frankenstein. Polidori then expanded upon the idea. While the story was the first to bring elements of vampire folklore into literature, it didn't receive the attention that Stoker's Dracula would 80 years later. Another pre-Dracula vampire story was published in 1847 and called The Feast of Blood, or Varney the Vampire, and is attributed to either James Rymer or Thomas Prest. This story was a penny dreadful serial that was the first to declare that the vampire, Sir Francis Varney, had fang-like teeth to open up the veins of the neck in his victims. However, the narrative was a bit hard to follow, and therefore the story faded into obscurity rather quickly. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 serialized novel, Carmilla, further incorporated the vampire into the Gothic horror genre, adding conflict between the vampire Carmilla's romantic and predatory desires surrounding Laura, the female protagonist. The exploration of sexual identity and the supernatural, as well as the sense of dread throughout the book, captivated Victorian audiences. Carmilla became personally involved with her victim, which was very different from previous vampire stories. In all of these pre-Dracula vampire novels, the vampire is rich, which made it easier for them to get away with murder, alluring, avoidant of daylight and anything church-related, and slowly drained their victims over several months, causing symptoms of disease in the victim. It was inferred that the vampires had long fangs, supernatural strength or agility, unnaturally long life, could shapeshift into animals, pass through walls, travel great distances without being noticed, and must return to their coffin or tomb to recover at some point. Some of these elements also appear in Gothic ghost literature, so it's possible they were drawing on other supernatural creatures for the new powers of the vampire. Several things from the original folklore remained, however. The fact that vampires are undead, that they feed on the blood of the living, and their connection to contagion and disease. Count Dracula possesses all of these powers and more. The characters in the book assume he gained these powers through dealings with the devil. Chapter 18 of the book describes most of Dracula's powers. It also gives the details that tie him to the real Vlad Dracula. To summarize all the details from the Patreon episode, Vlad Dracula was a ruthless ruler of Wallachia, which is now an area of Romania called Transylvania. He earned his nickname, the Impaler, by mass impaling his enemies and civilians during his reign. The details in the book that tie the fictional Count Dracula to Vlad the Impaler are related by the character Van Helsing, a vampire hunter. He states that Count Dracula was a Transylvanian noble descended from Attila the Hun, and that he lives in a castle in the Carpathian Mountains near the Borgo Pass. He also mentions that Dracula was a voivoda, or ruler, and took up arms against the Turks across the Danube River, and was known as a brutal and clever leader. Other than these sparse details, there's nothing else that ties the two together. Stoker didn't have any detailed notes mentioning Vlad the Impaler, and it's thought he found the name in a brief description in a book, and settled on it in order to tie his character to a location where vampire lore runs incredibly deep. Back to Dracula. Many of Dracula's powers have origins in previous vampire lore and literature, but have been expanded upon by Stoker. Blood drinking doesn't just sustain Dracula, it also grants him eternal youth, as long as he has a ready supply. The book begins with him as an old man, but as he travels and consumes more blood, he becomes younger and younger. This carries over in that he cannot die of old age, as blood restores him, and that he has all the wisdom of all the ages he's lived, making him very clever. Like previous vampires, Dracula can shape change, but he prefers to turn into a bat. While he does change into other things like mist, wolves, and fog, his preference for bats forever associated bats with vampires. Most vampire folklore holds that vampires are creatures of the night, but only because the night is best for not being seen while they creep around hurting people. It was Stoker who wrote that sunlight reduced Count Dracula's vampiric powers and stopped him from being able to turn into a bat. The idea that the sun can turn a vampire to dust came later in the 1922 film Nosferatu. More on that in a moment. The state of rest that Dracula and other vampires in the books go into during the day is described in the novel as a death-like sleep, in which the vampire sleeps open-eyed but is unable to awaken or move, and might be unaware of trespassing individuals. Also, if the vampire overindulged during the night, they might end up resting for longer. Dracula specifically requires the soil of his homeland, Transylvania, to be nearby or even within his coffin in order to successfully rest. Without it, he cannot recover his strength. Like previous vampires, he has superhuman physical abilities, but unlike previous vampires, Dracula's are extremely superhuman. He has strength the equivalent of 20 strong men, making him immune to most conventional means of attack, and a powerful foe in a fight. He's also extremely fast, and can defy gravity to walk on the walls and ceilings. While previous vampires eventually killed their victims and turned them into vampires, Dracula had more of an effect on his victims. He could influence and even control them. He could turn them into vampires by draining them of blood and letting them drink his own vampiric blood. He could then control them as vampires as well. Because of this, when he's killed, the curse is released from his victims. Even those he's turned into vampires return to the world of the living. He can also influence and sometimes control those humans who are mentally unstable. Some of the new powers granted to vampires by Stoker do have some basis in other folklore. The trope that vampires have no reflections in mirrors comes from Dracula. He also doesn't cast a shadow. However, the concept of dark creatures lacking reflections in mirrors is much older than Dracula. Medieval Europeans believed that people who had given up their souls, either by selling them to the devil or committing a horrible sin, didn't have reflections in mirrors. Dracula cannot cross running water, though he may be carried across it. He might also be able to cross at high or low tide. This inability to cross running water is new to vampires, but not new to folklore. In ancient European folklore, running water was seen to have special powers. It was believed that evil and impure things could not cross it. This may have origins in the fact that running water is safer to drink, as vermin and insects can't contaminate it. There were other substances that were also thought to repel evil, including salt and garlic, which Stoker included as things that also repel vampires. Lots of early Christian folklore was included in Stoker's new vampire lore. Like the devil and his legion of demons, Dracula has powerful hypnotic, telepathic, and illusionist abilities. He can command animals long associated with evil, such as rats, moths, and wolves. He has some teleportation abilities as well, being able to travel and appear in unhallowed grounds and on the graves of those who took their own lives. This has some limitations, as he has to know of the locations to be able to appear there. Similar to demons, Dracula must also be invited in before he can enter any abode. Once invited, however, he can come and go as he pleases. Also similar to demons and the devil, he can manipulate weather to a certain degree, such as creating storms and fog, mostly in order to obscure himself or as a warning or show of power. Also similar to demons in Christian folklore, Dracula's preferred victims are female. Throughout history, Christianity has held that women are more prone to influence by the devil, or more prone to evil in general. The legendary first woman, Eve, was easily tempted by Satan. Jewish mythology has a similar story, in which Adam's first wife, Lilith, was banished from the Garden of Eden for disrespecting Adam and falling in with Samael, the Hebrew version of Satan. In the book, Stoker mentioned that placing a wild rose on Dracula's coffin can confine him within it. Various cultures have folklore surrounding roses. In ancient Greek mythology, roses were associated with the goddess Aphrodite, and she gave them, or oils made of them, to warriors as protection. For early Christians, the rose was a symbol of the Virgin Mary, which eventually led to the creation of the rosary as a prayer tool. Some of Dracula's character traits are also inspired by early and medieval Christian mythology. Like Lucifer, Dracula pities ordinary humans for their revulsion to their darker impulses. He feels human emotions and often says that he can love, but he prefers the primal and predatory impulses of humanity. When he gives in, he's often unable to control his bloodlust, which is used to lure him into traps. Like many a demon, Dracula wears a mask of cordiality, but it quickly drops and he flies into fits of rage when his plans are frustrated. All of these new powers gave Dracula an allure and mystique that Victorian readers couldn't resist. It's possible that this new portrayal of vampirism as a disease of contagious demonic possession, with its undertones of sex, blood, and death, struck a chord in Victorian Europe. The age-old fears about sickness were on the rise again, and wasting and bleeding diseases like tuberculosis and sexually transmitted infections like syphilis were running rampant in the overcrowded and poorly sanitized cities. Following the novel's publication, some reviewers praised its terrifying atmosphere, while others thought it was too horrifying, but it remained popular since its publication, enthralling the Western world like no horror novel had done before. The significance of the novel and its direct impact on subsequent vampire-themed works led Stoker being popularly regarded as the father of vampire fiction. In 1979, a version of Dracula was released which included a lost chapter of the story, entitled Dracula's Guest. This short story had been published previously by Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's wife, 2 years after his death. It follows an unnamed Englishman's experiences in Munich during his journey to meet with Count Dracula. Critics are currently divided over whether this story was originally the first chapter of Dracula, but was cut, or was always intended as a separate story. Count Dracula grew to be among the most depicted fictional characters of the Victorian era, with over 700 adaptations in literature and on stage. This only grew with the rise of film in the 20th century. The first film adaptation of Dracula was F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, which was released in 1922, with Max Schreck starring as Count Orlok, the new name given to the Count in order to try and avoid a copyright strike. However, it was obviously a complete replication of the story of Dracula. Stoker had died in 1912, but his wife, Florence, sued the filmmakers, stating that they had neither asked for permission to adapt the book, nor paid Stoker's estate any royalty. The case dragged on for years, with Florence demanding the destruction of the original film negative and all prints ever created from it. She eventually won her case in 1925. Only a single print of the film survived, and it later gained intense popularity, being remade in 1979 by Werner Herzog and again in 2024 by Robert Eggers. The first authorized film version of Dracula came out in 1931 when Universal Studios released Todd Browning's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. It was also one of the first sound-inclusive horror films that was without any comic relief. It was a huge success, and Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula established the character as both an archetypical vampire and a cultural icon. The film also paved the way for other classic horror films like Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Wolfman to be taken on by film studios. Dracula the film was remade several times, starring Christopher Lee as Dracula in the Hammer Studios version, Gary Oldman in Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation, and Luke Evans in Dracula Untold. Films focusing on other characters in the book were also produced, such as Dracula's daughter, Renfield, and others. Beyond remakes and other films involving characters from Dracula, a whole host of new vampire literature, film and television took Stoker's new version of the vampire and ran with it. In the 1960s, Gothic romance writer Marilyn Ross wrote a series of books called the Dark Shadows series, featuring a vampire called Barnabas Collins. This book series was then made into a television series in the 1960s called Dark Shadows, which was made into a film more recently. This series set a new trend for seeing vampires as tragic heroes rather than alluring but evil predators. This tragic hero trope was then set in stone by the highly popular Vampire Chronicles written by Anne Rice between 1976 and 2008. While her novels included romance, there is still a very big focus on horror. After Anne Rice's series, even more emphasis was placed on romance involving vampires. This fad peaked recently with Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series, which came out between 2005 and 2008. Since then, vampire romance has become a standard of the young adult and adult genre of books. While the old bloated version of the vampire has faded, a charming yet dangerous version has replaced it. They are still associated with hunger and contamination. Some are sadistic killers, reveling in the conquest of prey, while others are ashamed of their bloodlust and do all they can to avoid feeding on humans, even wishing to become human once more. Both versions fascinate and repel us. Why? Vampires aren't just an explanation for misfortune or evil anymore. They have become complex individuals just like humans. The shift in the lore, from bloated killer to tragic hero, may represent a shift in humanity's own view of the world. Vampire literature shows that the dark nature of the world is known and that there is nuance there. While some vampires are content to be monstrous, others seek to be better than their darker nature. With some work, even a vampire can be redeemed, understood, loved, just like humans. Over time, vampires have come to represent otherness as a version of humanity's ideal self, flawed, at constant war with their primal urges, yet strong, beautiful, and immortal. Through their struggle, we explore the fragility of human life, the fear of losing it, and the acceptance of death. There's also the interplay between desire, submission, and dominance, with the vampire always fighting for control over humans, over other vampires, and over themselves. We as humans either want to rebel against them or help them rebel.
Put beautifully by Mackenzie Phillips, whose wonderful master's thesis I read during my research, the vampire has served as a double for humanity, helping us define human and monster and the vast gray areas between those classifications. And that is why vampires spark our curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.